The journey of post-traumatic growth for me was filled with fear and uncertainty. And one of the biggest causes of that uncertainty was the awareness that in order for me to have been so hurt and so ineffective with so many, quote, therapists, I had to have blind spots and inadequacies of my own. In other words, the more that I grasped that my therapists and lovers and friends lacked competence or had a sadistic streak, the more that reflected on my judgment. And so that created a crisis because the obvious conclusion was that the operating system that I was using could not be trusted to get out of the problem it couldn't be trusted to keep me out of in the first place. Because in the famous statement, the level of intelligence that is required to cause a problem is not adequate to solve the problem that it causes. So this was a crisis. Where to turn? Now, fortunately, A Stranger in a Cafe was my first introduction to trauma and PTSD in any meaningful way. And this is a criticism of the cult as well as the majority of therapists, that trauma and PTSD had, one, never been diagnosed despite symptoms, and two, that I was ignorant of what trauma was, or that it was something that one could experience in peacetime. I mean, I knew that veterans could be traumatized when explosive devices blew up their vehicles, but I didn't realize that children could develop complex PTSD through all manner of childhood abuses, what the symptoms were, or that a therapist under the influence of psychedelics could re-traumatize and induce additional trauma. I was not aware of that. So A Stranger in a Cafe introduced me to the paradigm. I started reading about it that afternoon. And upon identifying the traumatic theme that was running through these events, I began reading everything that I could via the Audible app. So I couldn't actually, at the time, focus enough to read, so I listened. And anything that I could find on the subject of trauma, I purchased and listened to, probably an average of several hours a day at that point. So that's one trajectory that ultimately led to more than 1,000 hours of digested data and information about the paradigm of trauma. Now, the symptoms that I suffered from at that point were multiple. Terror, loneliness, invisibility, helplessness, rage, and worthlessness. So these feelings combined, and also confusion and distrust, and a lack of regulation, meaning, I was easily triggered and re-triggered into the full intensity of pain and fear and anger that nobody was doing anything about it. So these were, some of the symptoms. And they're very difficult symptoms to respond to in Western culture. while traumatized in a deeply emotional state. And when one is abused by one's therapist, it doesn't help when, it doesn't lead to much trust in therapists. And unfortunately, a lot of therapists have not been, have not developed any skill or empathy for this terrain. In many cases, a therapist will even side emotionally, psychologically, by identifying with the abuser. With the former therapist that abused me, Peter Sandhill, as opposed to actually understanding what it's like to go through that as a client. So I explored that a little bit with therapists, but gave up on therapists as an adequate tool. Continuing the process of learning, at one point it became very useful to grasp the idea that the system that I was holding as the default, as my ally, might actually be inverted. Meaning, if parents and teachers and the cult at large and the community were actually responsible for a sustained pattern of abuse and trauma, then, and if their recipes had escalated the symptoms, then there might be a good chance that if I did the exact opposite, if I turned the system on its head and looked at what was normal, what was going on, and I did the opposite, that I might get somewhere. And this proved to be the case. Now, one of the first areas I applied this was with my anger that the most vulnerable, traumatized people in the world were asked to pay the most money and take the biggest risks to hire and get support at the time when they could least afford it, physically, emotionally, and financially. So, that is the system. So what's the system on its head? Well, it would be empathy. It would be taking a committed stand for another human being because that was the right thing to do when they were going through trauma, rather than trying to exploit it for financial gain or turn away from it sociopathically as not my problem. So nobody was doing that to me. And so I also began to flip that a little bit. I thought, I have no control of what other people are doing. I do know how much it's hurting me that no one, not a single person on the planet, not family, not therapists, etc., is making my trauma, my pain, my loneliness their highest priority. And in most cases, there's actually a backlash, meaning the more that I expose of what's actually going on, the more I am punished by dissociation out of a sociopathic ethic of, well, you're going through a lot of pain. You're not going to be very useful to me having a good time right now, so I'm going to add to your pain by dissociating, by judging, abandoning, putting up a wall of some kind. And so when I met a young woman who was in need, who was dealing with some traumas of her own, I thought this could be a good chance to give that which I wanted to receive. And so it was the first relationship that I entered purely to be of service. How can I help? What's going on? And, as psychologically, in grief and chaos and loneliness as I was, I still had a competent mind and a number of life skills and a lot of experience in business and, certainly a lot more money than she did. And so I took it upon myself to invite a mentoring relationship in which she did most of the work, but I would be useful. And I did all the things for her that I was angry that nobody was doing for me. And it was very gratifying to see her life and well-being just take off. Now, this was medicine in a couple of different forms. First of all, it was inverting the system. The system that was abandoning me for being traumatized was now inverted to I was supporting her precisely because she was traumatized. And I was feeling useless and valueless because I was being rejected in my efforts to bring trauma into the forefront in all the phases of the culture. But in this relationship, far from being useless, I was the single most important, valuable, useful person in another human being's life because of my impact on sustainable well-being. And so that was a medicine. There was also medicine. It's very hard not to hate a system that takes something horrendously painful and makes it worse, and then worse, and then worse. I mean, where does that end? And then doesn't want to change and learn something about it. So one of the medicines of this was a positive focus, because it was very quickly the most interesting and exciting part of my life was watching her ascend. And this also provided validation, because one of the reasons I was so angry, so hurt, was I knew it was my nature to ascend if a single person gave me the support that I needed. And it wasn't hard. It just wasn't forthcoming. Meaning if a single person had asked, how can I help? I would say, do this, this, and this, and, would enjoy transcending the trauma. It's just nobody asked. And when I would volunteer suggestions, there was generally an awareness that I was not the highest priority. I was a distant priority and more of an issue to be managed than a human being to be helped through this. And I had this sense of a car wheel being on my shoulder and not having the strength to get it off me. And I realized that it would take 5 or 6 people, maybe 7 people, to lift up that tire of the car. And I could slide out of there in a matter of minutes. But I couldn't find one that would put all their energy into lifting that up. And I was under the wheel. I couldn't get out. And I just lay there for years, watching people walk on by. And every single time this happened, I reflected on the probability field, the mathematics of what I was witnessing. In other words, if 1,000 people walk on by or do anything other than put their weight under the car, it means there's less than 1,000th of the population that has a good grasp on trauma and understands the mechanism and who can see clearly. That's a dismal statistic. Now, I also recognize that if I'm being marginalized and treated this way because I have trauma, I know that minorities have it much worse. I know that people that have less articulating talent have it much worse. So I'm just reflecting on how much of the global population is set up for this kind of pain without intelligent relief, and it's horrifying. But this doesn't seem to be a priority for many people. And that is horrifying, right? It's a tremendous awareness of the full extent of willful ignorance, of fear, and the sociopathic ethic. And the most astounding thing it was discovering that all the therapists who had been negligent in not familiarizing themselves and me with the paradigm of trauma while I was demonstrating traumatic symptoms didn't actually want to learn. In other words, they were invested in their walled ignorance. And this is horrendous, because if 40 of, above average therapists are willfully ignorant and putting their patients' lives and well-being in jeopardy to sustain their moat of useful knowledge in order to avoid critical feedback, then this was telling me that the therapeutic community was sick. And, this is so wrong relative to, the kind of world we could create if some of these variables were changed. And so, one of the things that doing the 1,000 hours of research did is it actually put me in touch with some of the better, healthier, more knowledgeable voices around trauma, some of the more ethical voices. And I felt less alone, but also I felt validated. So I felt less invisible and validated. Now, the other thing that I did was create websites of education and protest. I refused the protocol of don't ask, don't tell. In other words, people in the cult would continue not to ask, and in many cases not to listen, but I stopped doing my part of the abuse dynamic by being silent. I started speaking up, and doing so through websites that were specifically focused around the nucleuses of ignorance and incompetence that I had and was encountering. Now, the other positive focus is I realized, that I would have loved to have heard someone like me talking about all this stuff as I was going through it, and I didn't come across someone like me. They may be out there, but I didn't come across them. And so, as I was clear about what would be really useful for me at this point, I decided to become some of that. And with the website understandtrauma.com, I began talking through the journey and narrating the steps. So as I was learning about trauma, I was also narrating what I was experiencing. And I realized that while unfortunately in a sick cult, the people that most need to listen to this are actually therapists, but that these are the least people willing and able to listen to a client that has been repeatedly traumatized and shamed by incompetent therapists. I looked at this from a variety of different angles. I also started to gather statistical data. For example, I invited 100 therapists to do an interview and to explore trauma in the relationship between clients and therapists. And none of them wanted to do an interview, meaning 100% of the 100 or plus therapists that I contacted had various defenses against doing an interview. And I also noticed that their reasons, could be detected from their line of questions. Would people see this? In other words, no therapist in this dialogue, of the few people that engaged in any dialogue rather than just avoiding it, no therapist asked questions about how could we have the most positive impact in the world? How do you think I could best help people avoid certain mistakes? Their focus was on themselves, not their clients. And that also kind of helped me realize an atrocious thing, which is that many therapists are actually therapists because studying psychology in university was one of the few areas they could get some sense of the abuse that they had experienced. And then because that's really the only way to learn anything in this cult. And so, I realized that many therapists and psychologists, etc., are actually among the most traumatized and abused people in the culture that were, in some ways, seeking courage through listening to their clients, learning from their clients, forming bonds with their clients. Because in the therapeutic relationship, the client is far more vulnerable than the therapist. And so that feels safe for someone who's, has a lot of insecurity in relationship, et cetera. And so, that was also an awareness. And so there's all these different parts of, the system. And the cult is generally pretty good at defending itself. And so what that means is that the fractal representations of the cult, the individual egos that are invited into a situation of vulnerability, of intensity, of change, do their best to decline the invitation, because otherwise the cult in its fractal representation of the ego starts to change. And the cult and the ego are both afraid of change. They're afraid of the unknown because it means being out of control. And there's a basis of fear between the identity and the other, the unknown, which ironically is produced by trauma. So I started to write and I started to make videos about these topics. And I felt pretty terrible a lot of the time. I felt very stuck a lot of the time. So then I would talk about that. And that was often exhausting. And then I would talk about that. Another thing that I did was form a nonprofit, happinessdata.org, because I wanted, as I was criticizing, there was the Human Awareness Institute is the umbrella organization and nonprofit that was cocooning and punishing the victims of sexual abuse in order to protect the nonprofit organization, of which Peter Sandhill and Ann Watts and others that I'd asked for help around the sexual abuse that came through that organization were actually trying to protect the organization by denying the threat to its members and protect the leadership, not protect the public. And so this was another, big thing where, it was just horrific to see tax-free public money actually being used to protect sexual offenders at the expense of the public. So again, and then resisting change, right? And so by forming a nonprofit, then that leads to a design question. Well, what would a good nonprofit design look like, and how would it be implemented? And that led into ideas of technology and an interest in apps. I did a lot of projects throughout this period. It was important to try and have a positive focus, because it was very difficult to sleep. I was in a tremendous amount of pain and grief on a deep physiological level, and was trying to give birth to a new identity that seemed to be threatening in its candor and its focus to most members of the cult, including my family. So, this, designing a nonprofit, thinking things through. I did a project for a month, for example, where for 20 minutes a day, I would spend up to $20 and cause the most benefit that I could imagine to the most people. So one day I cleaned up a beach, one day I wrote something, one day I hired an artist to write a song, and I would just spend 30 minutes a day for 30 days exploring how can I have the most positive impact on the most people, and where does that thought and that question take me? And so I did a little website and project on that. It was very enriching where that led, because it led to app technology, and then that also helped to give birth to the nonprofit, because if I was going to develop an app for that goal, I didn't want to have to pay taxes to develop the app. And so, developing a nonprofit was part of it. I also got myself out of the U.S. to create some dissociation from the coldness, from the mentalness of the cult, and got myself to the Philippines and Thailand. I recruited an energy healer and trained her to do optimal energy work for me for an average of 2.5 hours a day. And that brought the pain down for time so that I could think, because it was so painful I couldn't think. And so, that was important in making room for a positive impulse to emerge. Being in a more feminine culture was definitely helpful. Strangers in Thailand and in the Philippines, but particularly in Thailand, strangers treated me better and more empathically than my family, my therapists, or anyone that I knew in the U.S. And so set and setting is really important for this kind of work, and Thailand was the best place for me. Thailand also is much freer in many ways. There's much less confinement and judgment, and so there's much less self-consciousness and condemnation in Thailand than there is in the U.S. And that was very important, because I had been maneuvered into a position in which I was thinking I had an identity of thoughts, feelings, words, behavior, that and sensations that I didn't like, and that the old me would have had a lot of issues with. And so I had to get to know this new, angrier, more enraged, less regulated me, in a lot more pain, and learn to love that me that nobody else could love, that nobody else was loving well. And so that's a crisis, how to love something that most of the world is afraid of. And so that's and it's intimidating. I let myself spend money freely, because if money could buy any form of temporary or sustainable well-being that reduced the pain to a level that would keep me alive, then that seemed like the highest priority. So I spent money freely, and thankfully I had saved up a fair amount. So I burned through about $80,000 trying to manage, and stabilize mostly psychological pain that was showing up in these intense physical sensations. I let myself sleep erratically, often sleeping during the day and staying up all night. And the mentee, the woman I spoke about, at the beginning of this, as I got more and more excited about her life, as she was growing and lifting up as a result of my influence, I found myself falling in love. And so I had very carefully asked her if she thought she would be better off with what would likely be a somewhat abusive, short-term romantic relationship, or a more supportive and distant mentorship and friendship. Because when you have PTSD and are going through strong symptoms, those symptoms radiate out in direct proportion to the proximity of the people around us. And so she would, as a lover, become in the closest position. And then traumatic romantic relationships have a low statistical probability. And, if I looked at the 100 lovers that I had spent time with in the last 15, 20 years, statistically, the average relationship lasted a month, right? And so I wanted to give her the worst case scenarios and do it via email and stuff, and so we talked about all that, before deciding. And I let her make the initiative. I said, we could go either way. And I didn't talk about, my love for her, etc., because I didn't want to seduce her into that. I wanted her to make that from a rational place. And, to my delight, she chose to be lovers. Which brings me into the medicine of orgasm. Orgasm can reset some of the traumatic states of trauma. On the other side of an orgasm, the anxiety that can't calm down. I found I could sleep, for example. And so there's medicine in an orgasm that comes from making love in a secure emotional attachment. Now, there was still a lot of fear and insecurity because there were so many hurdles, mostly from the U.S. government. She was Filipina, and the U.S. government requires a year of paperwork, stress, and hassle and insanity to have someone from the Philippines visit me, meaning it took a year of hassle and paperwork and uncertainty just to have my friend, the most important person in my life, actually be free to come to my house. And only under the auspices of marriage, meaning if I didn't promise to get married within 90 days, she would be evicted from the U.S. This is absurdity. And it's a sick joke, really, as one encounters one layer of sadistic and sociopathic behavior after another, and one's own tax dollars not helping you in a state of trauma, not helping me, but actually harming the most important relationship. My money used to harm the most important relationship for me, for my survival, my well-being at that time. And that is current immigration policy in the U.S. So, that, process, becoming a teacher and a useful teacher, learning, this studio here set up is part of that, is kind of on that continuum, making useful media. I began this video today because I was wanting to find an audiobook on stories of post-traumatic growth. And I don't know that there is one. But that's the kind of thing, like, it's not there, so be the thing that I want that's missing in the world, that's missing in my world. So that's a very good medicine. another kind of important intermediary step was to establish like a few hours worth of daily positive routine, but then let the rest of the day be reactive. Meaning, in enormous pain, there's so many different compulsive things that are all just about pain management and that kind of go on their own kind of thread. But I set aside like 2 or 3 hours a day in which these 2 or 3 hours are going to be productive, and then the rest can do whatever it wants to do. But I will, I will check off these things that need to get done every day. So that was very useful, and slowly that time frame has grown to a point where I can now spend an 8-hour day if I want to, like 7 years later, and not be burnt out entirely. I can do that. Before, it was a question: can I do an hour? Can I do 2 hours? Can I do 3 hours? And for a year or so, it was like 3 hours. And so, that was useful. Setting and reviewing goals, writing letters. But one of the biggest threads also was the various things that I did for the woman who became my wife, Jen. I got her a dog so that she wouldn't be lonely when the U.S. wouldn't let her join me in the U.S. and I had to fly back. But the dog that I got for her has become the most valuable resource of kind of a secure emotional attachment for me. The art supplies that I got for her to be creative became the inspiration for me to start painting and doing a variety of things. So I learned, in a sense, that in this state, I didn't have a clear sense of what was good for me. But if I focused on what was good for her, good things seemed to come to me that wouldn't have come to me directly. And I even found that in dreams. She would have dreams, and I'd ask her to describe the dream, and the dreams would have messages in them. And then I would act on the messages, and good things would happen for our life as a result of me listening to her dreams. I taught her to do inner child work and inner child meditation and healing. That lifted a lot of the traumatic load for her, which then left a very clean space for me, rather than both of our traumas kind of compounding. And I also have focused strongly on her independence, meaning when we met, she wasn't making anywhere near the amount of money that I was making, and didn't have savings and all of that. And so you always have healthier relationships when there's a balance of power. When one person doesn't have the ability to dominate the other person, because both people have their own resources. And so I I made it clear, and actually a condition of the relationship, that however long the relationship lasts, that she must get stronger emotionally, financially, mentally, in skills, in logistics, in savings, etc. That she has to get stronger every month that we're together, that it's not a relationship that weakens her by making her dependent on me. And so I think that's been a very good discipline. And she doesn't, always want that. Meaning there's an impulse in all of us to stay a child, to, look for the perfect parent as opposed to have to figure out how to do things on our own. And, but that's been a very clear boundary of mine, not always comfortable, but I taught her how to drive. I helped her get a driver's license, buy her first car, and learn to cook, certain dishes, learn to do different work for somebody else, work for me, be held accountable for different things. And my goal was always that if I died, she could, just continue taking off without any issue, that I wouldn't make it easy for her such that my death would then be a big hardship. But I would kind of try and be the kind of boss that if she could satisfy me, she could satisfy most bosses. Most bosses are going to fire you if you show up late, and so I'm not going to tolerate lateness. Most bosses require you to do some kind of a checklist. So, how good is your checklist of what you do on a daily basis, and how much are you learning, and all of these things. So, but one of the things that I found is the process of disciplining and teaching her, because in an employer role, there's a discipline element, it was very obvious what she needed to do. And step by step, I started to copy that more because I had lost touch with some of that with all the trauma. I wasn't as disciplined myself in any number of ways. Watching YouTube, getting YouTube Premium so there wasn't any ads, watching, lots of documentaries about trauma. That was very helpful. Writing books that I thought would be useful, again, helpful. And then, when I realized that nowhere in the world did I know a place to go to for optimal traumatic recovery. I knew there was a beach on Palawan where I had felt a great deal of healing, just laying in the waves for days at a time. I knew that, falling in love was very useful with an empathic person. I knew that quiet and nature was wonderful. I knew that loud noises and shocks and TVs in the next hotel room were terrible for this. But I didn't know where to go. And there was some desperation I felt. And the best places that I found, little things would just ruin them. Suddenly there would be a birthday karaoke right next to where I was trying to meditate, and then I feel helpless again. And and that helplessness gets triggered and spirals down into rage and all this stuff. And it's like, where do I go to just have control of the soundscape? I don't know. It's because no one seems to be designing for traumatic recovery. No one's checking in. The neighbor playing karaoke isn't saying, anyone traumatized over there that needs silence? No, everyone's just doing their own random thing with no attunement. And that's very sad. It's one of the expressions of loneliness from an isolated, dissociated, traumatized, independent cult, where everyone's doing their own thing, the cult of the ego, but no one's actually learning what's going on for their neighbors. Maybe you want to play some heavy metal and your neighbor is on their deathbed and there's no communication. And a death that could be peaceful becomes fearful and enraged. And that's so sad. It's so inefficient, that lack of knowledge. So I began designing a community that would actually be the place that I wanted to go to recover and couldn't find. And that's been the big thrust in, the last few years is, first of all, as my wife joined the business with her talent for connecting, we started to attract a better crew. And with a better crew and me staying in town rather than rushing overseas to escape the mediocrity of social life in the US, as I experience it, I stayed more present, and my wife actually couldn't leave initially. And so by being here and having her on board, my income went up substantially. And there was a reason for that. The reason was the desire for the nonprofit. I started 2 nonprofits. And I wanted to put money away, and I wanted to start saving up money for a community. And so that's really been the driving thrust, and looking at land in different places and building laws and looking where can I create the kind of culture that I wanted and couldn't find. And I looked in Hawaii, looked in Ecuador, looked in Palawan, looked in Oregon, looked in Florida, looked in Thailand, but eventually settling in Costa Rica and a community project, medicina.org. And it's so exciting to be creating that which I most wanted and couldn't find, that which was priceless, that would have been worth millions if I'd had the money, but wasn't available for any price. And how to begin to create that. And so going to Costa Rica and noticing, my sex life is up. My relaxation is up, Increased quantity and quality of sex up 300%. Increased levels of relaxation up 300%. Compulsive behavior down 300%, including media watching. And more presence, right? So I'm looking and then starting to lose weight and being less interested in, obsessive and mental activities. And suddenly it's like, wow, this is a great place to be. And then combining that with the beauty of the landscape, etc. And so Medicina, a community with an intention of being the medicine, is born. And as a 50-acre project, it can consume all of the time and all of the money that I can give to it. And that has made my business sacred again. The idea of making more money so that you can make more money, I have had contempt and sadness around that motif. The love of money for its own sake, in biblical terms, the root of all evil, not money, but the love, obsession with money. And so I've never been obsessed with money, but I'm now, possessed with the dream, the desire of Medicina to flourish. So every day that I work hard and put in, $1,000 here, $3,000 there, $5,000 there, that's flowing into a dream. That's flowing into a healing of filling the void that wasn't met for me, and understanding how important that is for certain others. It's exciting. And so, there's different, other medicines along the way, getting rid of an abusive landlord situation, being in a beautiful space, finding a friendly neighborhood, buying fresh flowers, doing art together. My wife introducing me to Asian movies, you might check out Eternal Love, which is a Chinese series of about 100 different episodes. I think it's on Netflix under something like that, or The Legend of White Snake, and kind of learning a whole new culture's landscape of cinema was very fun and exciting. And so that's been my journey of post-traumatic growth. And so, I would say that the growth is a new, I'll kind of sum it up, a new type of relationship, a familiarity through 1,000 hours of traumatic studies, a reframing of the system as being the important thing to attune to, whatever the system is, to the awareness that all systems are flawed, and many of them are so flawed that inverting them actually gets better results than following them. The forming of a nonprofit, a relationship of service, deciding to get married, being in the longest relationship that I've been in, having a dog, writing a number of books in different ways than I would have written before, developing this persona, meaning this persona here is about 1,500 hours of time in front of a camera, particularly as memory and speech problems kind of develop shortly after the trauma. And you can still notice it, here and there in the edges. This is a technology, a skill set of putting things into words, of developing new ideas, developing a whole set of ideas and spending, 5, 10, 20 hours in front of a camera talking about this and this, and gradually getting to a point where I can then condense it into writing. It's easier to talk. It takes less energy in many ways to talk than it does to write. Creating this film studio capable of doing this easily, and growing my company's income 400%, and having a reason to do that. Growing retirement income, starting the 2 nonprofits and putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into those nonprofits, and figuring out what a good nonprofit design looks like. Reinventing myself and accepting these types of things. I also have both, engaged in more challenge and embraced aggression in a way that, is still, there's a lot of fear there, there's a lot of uncertainty there, but it's a very useful energy, in ways that I was unfamiliar with before. Even the idea of protesting something rather than just leaving it because it wasn't a good fit. And so those are some of the fruits today that probably never would have existed without the re-traumatization, partly because they weren't necessary, partly because the pain wasn't bad enough to do something about it. And so here we are. If you want to tell your story, I would enjoy hearing it. And we could do that in an interview on Zoom. Or you can sit down in front of a phone or in front of a camera and share a story like this.